Hey everyone, and welcome back to my tutorial series on how to build a desktop application style object-oriented Discord bot in Python. So last time we looked at embedded messages, we looked at cogs, and we created a function that helps us create embeds a little bit easier and in a cleaner way. So what do I want to look at today? Well, before we get into any of the actual functionality of the bot, it's very important that we understand a little bit more about Discord's UI elements. Most people think of Discord as a text-based platform, and ultimately they're right. But Discord, as it's developed its API to be more friendly to bots and developers, such as ourselves, they've defined a couple of UI structures that are going to be invaluable during our tutorial. We've got buttons, select menus, and modal pop-ups that are all going to work in an extremely different and diverse ways to gather information from and display information to our user. Now, before we get started on that, though, I'd like to make a couple of edits because I did make some errors in our previous video. These are going to be straightforward, though. So you most likely spelled this correctly, but I wanted to just put it on the record as fixing our utilities folder, which I spelled without a third I. So let's make sure we spell it correctly. And then inside of our utils file, in the make embed function that we created, remember I distinctly said that we wanted to include none as our default value for the color parameter. I was wrong. I misread the documentation. We actually want this to be empty embed, just like the rest of them. And this also means that we can remove the optional typing right here. Okay, so I misread the documentation. Empty embed is passed into the constructor internally within the library, and that's the behavior that we want to mimic here. So it's not so much important that you understand why we switched out basically a null value for a null value. Just know that this is the correct default value that we want. Okay, so let's make a new directory in our project, and we're going to call it classes. This is where all of our classes are going to get stored just to keep things organized. And within classes, I want to make a new file called demo UI. This is going to be a throwaway file, but for the time being, this is where we're going to do all of our testing and all of our demonstration. At the start of the file, I want to go ahead and do our typical imports. So from future, import annotations. From Discord, we're going to import interaction to start. From discord.ui, and this is just going to be for this particular module for demonstration. Our UI is going to be in a different folder with a different set of imports later, but for now we're just going to import the UI namespace, and we're going to say button, input text, modal, select, and view. These are the 5 primary UI components that Discord defines for us. And then we're going to say from typing, import type checking like we always do. And if we're type checking, let's pass for now. Okay, great. Let me grab a horizontal rule and drop it in here. And we can get started. So since we're making an object-oriented bot, we're going to make everything in classes. So for this class, I'm just going to call it demonstration. And I'm going to pass a blank constructor for now. This is a personal preference. I just like to see a constructor immediately below the class definition. Obviously, this doesn't do anything for us, so you're free to leave it out if you want. But for me, I like to see it there. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a function called display components. Okay? This is going to take self, obviously, and it's also going to take an interaction that we're going to pass in later, and not going to give us anything back. And do note this is going to be an async function because we're going to be interacting with Discord through this interaction. So again, we need to make sure we wait for Discord's responses. Alrighty. So really quickly at the beginning, I'm going to define just a simple embed that we can use as our message content for the components that we're going to add. So embed equals, and we need to import our function that we made last time. So from utilities, import make embed, and we're going to say make embed, and I'm just going to add a title to it. This is how simple this function makes things, because all I'm doing is adding a title, and it's going to blank out the rest of that information for me and avoid any errors in the embed creation process. Demonstration UI elements, very good. So the first thing I'd like to take a look at is the view class. A view is what is attached to a message that contains other UI elements. So if you define buttons or if you define a select menu, you're going to need to insert those into a view in order for them to be attached to the message. So what do we want to do? We want to just define a view to start. Just like that. It doesn't need any arguments. Essentially, think of it like an empty box. Like, we need to have this box in order for the components to exist. However, the box doesn't perform any other function aside from just holding the things. Okay, so that's what our view is going to do. Later on, it's going to have a lot more internal elements and a lot more mechanisms that we're going to use inside of our code. But for now, it's just going to be a container. So how do I want to add stuff to this? What is it going to look like? Well, that's a good question. So let's actually take a look at this. Let's say await interaction.response, which is how we respond to an interaction for the first time. I'll go into that a little bit more later, but just know that you can only properly respond to an interaction one time with Discord. Otherwise, you'll need to use interaction.followup. But for now, we're only doing the main response. So we're going to access the response, and we're going to send a message as the response, and we're going to make it embed equals embed and view equals view. Okay, so everything here should work out. We've got an embed, we've got a view, and we're responding. So let's head back over to our cog that we created. And I've deleted all of the embed logic from last time. It was just for demonstration purposes and was a little messy. So this time what I want to do is from our classes in our imports, from classes.demoui, let's just import demonstration. And then down here in our testing command that we defined last time, I want to instantiate that. So we're just going to say demo is demonstration. Again, no arguments. And what I want to do is I want to say await demo, and now we're saying await because we made this an async function over here. So we want to say await demo dot display components, and we're going to pass in the interaction, right? But all we have is a CTX. All we have is the application context. Well, underlying in the application context is an interaction. Think about an application context as like interaction plus a bunch of bonus data. But we don't really need that bonus data for right now. So I'm just going to pass in the underlying interaction just like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to invoke the command, and then in that command we're just going to display a basic embedded message and a blank view just to see what it looks like, okay? Okay, so let's boot up our virtual machine here. And we're online, very good. And let's run our testing command. So this is going to be, again, an embed with just a blank view. And as you can see, we've got the embed, super easy, it's super basic, but we don't have anything below it. Again, that's because the view is an empty box, and it's clear. It's just waiting for us to put something in it. So it really serves no function right now. All right, so let's stop our virtual machine, and let's do a little bit more interesting stuff with that. Okay, so here we are back in our demonstration class. Under our view creation, let's define button 1. We're going to define a handful of buttons for just to visualize what our different stylistic elements are. But for now, let's just define 1. And we're going to pass 4 items into this constructor. The first thing I want to pass is the style, and we're going to use the button style enum. So if you haven't imported that, make sure you import button style from the Discord namespace. And for this one, we're going to set it to primary. The next thing we want to pass is the label. So that's pretty self-explanatory. It's the text that appears on the button. I'm just going to pass some generic text here. We can pass the disabled status. Obviously, I don't want this to be disabled right now. I want us to be able to click the button, so we're going to set that to false. And then we can set the relative row that our button is in. So for this circumstance, I'm just going to say 0. It's going to be the top row. There's nothing else in the view. We don't want to mess around with anything. And then finally, I'm going to say view.addItem. And we're going to add, you guessed it, button 1. Okay, so this is going to add this button to our view when we send our message. So let's see what this looks like and what it does. Over back here in Discord, let's go testing. And now we have our same message as before, but it has a button. And if I click on the button, nothing happens. And we get an interaction failed message. So why is this happening? Well, when we construct a button, in our code, it doesn't inherently know how to respond to a click. It only knows what a click is. So we need to set callback for our button in order for it to perform any kind of action in response to a click. And in addition, we have to respond to that interaction to prevent Discord from giving us an error saying that no interaction response was found. Next up, I'm going to quickly define a handful more buttons just so that you can see what some of the different styles look like. So we're going to say for this one, style is button style.secondary, and the label is button2. And I'm just going to duplicate this down. We don't by default, disabled is false, and by default, this is going to cram as many buttons into a row as possible. So we don't necessarily need to define those. I just like to do it to give us a little bit more fine-grained control over the aspects of the button. So let's make sure we add these to our view as well. Okay, so now we've got some more, and for the fifth button, I'm actually going to add this and make this disabled, just to demonstrate what a disabled button looks like. And we're going to set these to success, to danger, and we'll leave that as secondary. Okay, so we have 5 buttons defined. Let's see what this looks like in Discord. All right, so jumping back in here, we can run our testing command again. And as you can see, now we have 5 buttons, the 5th button of which is disabled. We even get the little cross saying we can't click it. And here are our 4 main button colors. Okay, so as you can see now, when we click on them, nothing happens because we haven't defined callback. And I find that the easiest way to define callback is through subclassing the UI elements. So let's head back over into our code and take a look at that. Okay, so let's shut off our bot for now, and we'll create a new directory in our project called UI for user interface. And then in the UI directory, I'm going to create a file called common.py. We're going to encapsulate a lot of common UI element logic in this file. And while we're just doing demonstration stuff right now, it's going to smoothly transition into creating a few classes that are going to be generic throughout our project that are going to give us some additional functionality beyond what the library offers. So let's do our normal imports first. So we're going to say from future import annotations. From Discord, we're going to import interaction. Since this is a UI file, we're going to say from discord.ui, and we're going to import all 5 of the elements for now: button, input text, modal, select, and view. From typing, we're going to import, from typing, we're going to import type checking, as usual. And let's just, if we're type checking, let's pass for now. I'm going to drop a horizontal rule in here. And let's go ahead and take a look at subclassing our button. So actually, before we subclass a button, let's subclass a view, because the view is the important part that's going to contain that button. So we're just going to say class, and we're going to say class frog view actually, because as we develop this, we're going to use this repeatedly throughout our code, and it will become clear why this is useful as we proceed. So in the frog view, I'm just going to do a basic init, def init, and here I'm going to put args and keyword args. So what this allows me to do is pass in the arguments and keyword arguments that you might use in a standard view constructor, and we can actually use this and pass it into the super call. Oh my goodness, super dot init, there we are. And we can pass args and keyword args into that in order to give it the exact same arguments that we put into our custom view. So I also want to define self.value. Self.value can be any value, and I'm going to import that from typing. And we're going to set it to none for now. Now we're going to edit this value from within the components of the view. You'll see how we do this in a minute. So above the view, let's make a demo button. And it's going to be a button. And we'll make a constructor with just some basic layout stuff. So we have style. It's going to be button style.primary. And let's make the label. Actually, let's get fancy. So here in the arguments, we're going to say direction. And the direction is going to be an int. And what I want to do here is if the direction equals 1, then I want our label to be count up. Okay? And then otherwise, because I'm only going to pass in one of two directions, so we can just use else label equals count down. And I also want to define the style, actually. So the style is going to be button style.primary for this. And then for this, the style is going to be button style.danger. Okay, and then we'll just set the style equal to style. And we'll set the label equal to label. And then I also want to cache a reference to that direction here. So we're going to say self.direction equals direction. And actually, let's type hint that as well, int32. Oh, wow. I've been using C# for a little while now. So okay, let's set up our callback, def callback. So this is what's going to happen when we press the button. So the first thing I want to do is respond to the interaction. So we're going to say interaction.response.sendMessage. See, and the reason that they specify send message here is you can also respond to an interaction with a modal pop-up. And that has to happen, again, in the response. You can only do that one time. So they need to differentiate between send modal and send message here, just for clarification. And we're going to say your current number is self.view.value. Okay. So why have I done this? So we're going to be referencing the value in this view that we made right here within the callback. And so we're going to be able to count up and down using these buttons. Okay. So if self.direction is 1, I want to increment the view's value. Plus equals 1. And you know, just for the sake of this, I'm going to set this to 0. So we don't have to initialize it. And then otherwise, I want to set the view value minus equals 1. Okay? And in addition, just to demonstrate a little bit of additional functionality, I want to say if self.view.value equals 5. So once we've finally gotten to 5, I want to say, in reference to the button, I want to say self.style equals button style.secondary. I'm going to say self.label equals disabled. I'm going to say self.disabled, disabled equals true. And then we want to make sure that we update the message that's involved with this. So I want to say await interaction.message. So this is the message that has been sending us interactions. So it's going to be the message this view is attached to. Message.edit, and we're going to say view equals self.view. So that's going to submit the updated view after we've done all this each time. Okay, so let's try testing. Oh, it might help if we put it into the view. So let's say self.addItem, and we're going to use demo button. And within the constructor, we just need to pass a direction. I'll pass 1 here, and I'll pass 2 here. Okay, so up here, before we finalize this, let's define our dunder all. And for this, I'm only going to put frog view, because we don't necessarily need to use the button outside of this module. It's just going to be internal. So the only thing I want to export right now is the view itself. So let's go back into our testing. I'm sorry, our demo UI. There we go. And from UI.common, let's go ahead and use our frog view instead. So this view is already going to have the buttons attached to it, so we don't actually need to do anything else in this function. So we should now be able to run our bot. Oh dear. UI.common has no import F. Oh dear, what have I done? Oh, there we go. forgotten my comma. Imagine that. All right, now we're up and running. Very good. Okay, so let's test. We've got 2 buttons, looking good. Okay, we can count back down. Uh-oh. There we go. So we have some weird behavior in here, but I'm basically trying to get you to understand that we can edit the view's value within the buttons. And as you can see up here, once we hit 5 internally, we're off by 1 when we clarify, but it did disable the button and turned it gray. So that gives you a little better idea of how we can edit views from within the callback of the components themselves. Okay, so let's build a little bit more onto our frog view. We can ditch the demo button for now, and we can ditch these calls. And set this back to none. Okay, so what are some other things that we can do with this, and how are they going to help us in our code? Okay, so the first thing I want to address is that anyone is able to click these buttons. So implicitly, the library doesn't know that we want only the owner to be able to click the button. So the person who invoked the command should be the only one controlling their particular message. So what I want to do is I want to add an argument in here, and it's going to be the first one, and I'm going to call it owner. And before we go any further, let's do a couple of imports. Let's do union from typing, and then we're going to do member and user here. Okay, so our owner is going to be a union, which is either a member or a user. Now, we've done this because typically you're going to be getting commands from a guild, which means you'll receive a member. But later on, we're going to add some support for private messaging, so we also want to have a user in here as well, because if you're not in a guild context, you're only going to get a Discord user. Okay, very good. So let me drop this down just to add a little bit more space here. Okay, and under our arguments here, I want to add a keyword argument called close on complete, and we're going to set this is a Boolean, and we're going to set this to false by default. Now, what this is going to allow us to do is this is going to allow us to specify whether we want to delete the message that we've sent after the view is finished dispatching. So that's going to become handy later when we have persistent views where the user is taking multiple actions in order to submit data, and we don't want that. We don't want that to clutter up the channel when it's done. So once they finish using it, it's going to delete itself so that we can present a preview of the profile after that. Okay, so let's cache a reference to the owner, self.owner, and it's a union member user. And that's going to equal the owner we passed in. I want to set self.value, and actually this needs to be optional since we have a none value here. So let's import that from typing and spell correctly. There we go. And I want to add a Boolean parameter here called self.complete. This is an additional parameter that's gonna interface with the close on complete. So when we set self.complete to finished, that's going to run the close on complete function. Okay, so complete is a Boolean, and we're going to set that to false by default. So the view is not complete by default. So down here, this will become clear later. Actually, you know what? Let's leave that out later, and we're going to say self.closeOnInteract. And I've used an underscore at the beginning here just to denote that this is an internal bit of information. We don't need to export that outside the frog view. So this is going to be an optional interaction, which is going to allow us to perform the delete for close on complete later. Okay, so this should, close on interaction is a Boolean. It's a little bit late, so bear with me. And we're going to say close on interact, close on complete. Let's rename this. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, I think the next logical step is to take advantage of this owner attribute that we have. So let's go ahead and override the function called interaction check. And oops, it's an async function. Okay, so interaction check is what happens before the bot responds to a dispatched action. So if we have a button click, we're going to do the interaction check before we actually process any of that callback. So if interaction.user, because we have the interaction right here, it gets passed in automatically, equals self.owner, which we pass in at the instantiation of the view, self.interaction, interaction, which we need to cache a reference to up here. So self.interaction is going to be an optional interaction. And we're going to set that to none initially, okay? Because right here, this is where we're going to assign it. And we're going to return true if the user is the same as the interaction's invoker. Otherwise, we're going to return false. We don't want any other users to be using this view. Okay, so now we're going to get a little bit fancy, and we're actually going to override the stop method for the view. Now, we didn't use stop previously when we were counting up and down, but typically if you want a view to finish dispatching, you say view.stop, and that's going to finalize everything in it. Nothing's going to be interactable anymore. So we're going to override that and give it a little extra behavior. First thing I want to do is call the initial stop function that's defined within PyCord, okay? Because that's going to perform all the internal logic that we need. And it's important to do that before the next step, because if we've decided that we want to close this on completion, then I want to say if self.interaction is not none, which it shouldn't be, since every time we interact with the view, we're going to be setting self.interaction, but it's always good to check, make sure that it's there. We're going to try doing await self.interaction.message.delete. Okay, so if we want to clean this up afterwards, first thing we're going to try to do is delete the message. Let's say that it's not working. So, except we're going to try one more thing. We're going to say await self.interaction.delete original response. Okay, so initially when you respond to an interaction, when you respond with callback to something, you're going to get an initial response, which is where you get the interaction from. However, if you perform any follow-ups on that interaction, so not the initial response, we're going to get a message object back. So the first thing we want to do is try to delete that message. Otherwise, we're going to try and perform the initial response delete. So in the event that that doesn't work, we're not going to worry about it. Okay, it's not worth setting up any kind of additional behavior to catch that. We're just going to try and delete it, and if for some reason that fails, too bad. Okay, so these are the two things that I want to touch on right now, and this is going to be extremely valuable in the rest of the code. Okay, so that's why I wanted to set it up initially. So I think I'm going to end the video there for now. What did we do today? We looked at making a class where we can call components, and we looked at how to include those components in messages. And then we built a super handy utility view that we can use throughout our code. And I think we're looking pretty good. So I'll see you in the next video.